Okay, so now we're going to switch gears. I'm about to host a panel, wearing a lot of hats today. And I want to call my fellow panelists on stage. So Marvin, Craig, and Carol, please join us. We're going to be talking about Silicon Valley. So a little bit of a gear change. Okay. I want, Carol, why don't you go there? Marvin, why don't you sit here? And Craig, why don't you sit on the end? Okay. Okay, so while we shuffle around a little bit, I'm going to pull up my questions. Okay. All right, definitely wearing a lot of hats today. I want to thank you all for joining us, and I want to go ahead and ask you to introduce yourself, and I want to do it in a little bit of a different way. So I want you to tell us who you are, where you work, but I also want you to tell us a little bit about your Silicon Valley story. So Marvin, since you're closest, I'm going to start with you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marvin. I'm partner at 500 Startups, which is an early stage seed fund as well as accelerator program. My Silicon Valley story, I've been to Silicon Valley. I moved to Silicon Valley in January 3rd of 1999. So was part of the first dot-com bubble. Joined a startup that early, very, very early as a first marketing hire at a startup that raised about $30 million. Company blew up and pretty much died in 2001 during the dot-com bust. Then I was very, very fortunate to join Yahoo back in 2001 and spent 10 and a half years there. And so I've kind of done the startup and the big company thing and was very, very fortunate to do well there. So I spent, in 2012, I left and spent 2 years just goofing around, angel investing, boards, advisory boards, and mentoring. And then was very, very fortunate to join 500, started the San Francisco office for them. And so I run the San Francisco office, and now I'm an investor. So that's my story.
That's quite the journey. All right, Carol, you're next.
Great. My name is Carol. I am a co-founder of a self-driving car startup called drive.ai. My Silicon Valley story is I went to college in Silicon Valley, left and missed it terribly. I was gone from Silicon Valley for about 10 years, and then I came back for work and to start this company. And so we've been doing drive.ai for about 3 years now.
Great.
Cool.
Your turn.
Good talk, by the way. That was great. I like your talk. So I'm Craig. I work at YC, and we're an accelerator. And I moved to Silicon Valley 4 years ago. I used to live in New York, and I used to do Photoshop at The Onion, so it was a very different job. And now I work in an accelerator.
Awesome. I think it's so great to have so many different perspectives on stage. And so I'm going to start with just a simple, easy question. What are some of the positives and negatives of Silicon Valley's culture? So I should say Silicon Valley's mecca status. So let's start there.
So the positive is that there's like an insane density of people working on similar things. There's also a density of people who have sold companies and made a bunch. So that kind of has compounded for the past 50 years, and it's created this culture where like it's very common to start a company. It's very easy to raise money relative to the rest of the world. The downside is that like everyone's been drinking the Kool-Aid for 50 years. Mm-hmm. So the types of companies, the types of role models, the types of business models are all very similar. That would be a big downside.
It's funny you should mention this, Carol. We talked a little bit about this backstage about sort of how coming into Silicon Valley with a new idea, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But did you want to add on anything to Craig's observations?
Sure. Yeah, Silicon Valley is a pretty magical place in the sense that networking is amazing. Just anyone that you turn around to on the train will have a story. And it's not always the greatest ideas that win out. It's just anything is possible. And a lot of that is due to networking. So that's pretty amazing that hopes and dreams do come true in Silicon Valley. The downside is very much like Craig was alluding to, this really strong groupthink that happens, and so much of it is also timing, because along with investing, many things are on trend at a certain point. So one story about Drive is that we had started slightly early on the self-driving car trend. Stanford has a long history with self-driving cars, and when our startup started in 2015, it was a little before the hype, I guess, that AI and deep learning and self-driving cars is today. So when we actually started pitching, we were rejected by a lot of the VCs because they had thought it was way too smart of a team to be working on too difficult of a problem. So it didn't get us down because I think we had this conviction. We knew that the timing was right. But it was weird that in 2015 when we were pitching, we were basically doing tutorials on deep learning. And the next year, the same VCs were giving me literature about deep learning and saying, oh, have you heard the latest results? And they had been so well studied in that last year. So that really kind of blew my mind just about how trends and groups happen.
Marvin?
So the good news is the good stuff about Silicon Valley. There's lots of money. There's actually tons of smart, accomplished people. I think the bad thing about it, it's become kind of like Hollywood for nerds, and I mean that really in a very negative way. And so the groupthink is really troublesome, and in many ways too, it's become sort of a big dystopian nightmare where there's a bunch of people who have done very, very well, and there's a whole bunch of people just struggling to survive because of this. It's become this, in my view, very Darwinistic sort of like libertarian sort of like nightmare.
So it's funny that you talk about who's doing well and who's struggling in Silicon Valley, because I would imagine that we have a lot of founders in the audience or people who are sort of interested to see who's succeeding in that environment. So Craig and Marvin, I know that you all both work at VCs and startups, and and accelerators, and you have that experience. And so I'd like to hear from you. Who do you think thrives, and who do you think doesn't do as well in the Valley? What are you seeing inside of your companies? Don't all rush to answer.
Do you mean like what types of companies?
Yeah,
or people,
what kind of?
or?
Yeah, I think it could be either, right? What type of companies or what types of founders tend to do well, and what types of folks tend to struggle.
Maybe I can jump in, right? So the nature of sort of such a competitive place and full of smart people, I think like there's an element. I think like Reid Hoffman talks about like Silicon Valley is a mindset, and so one of the challenges that I have. So for example, probably about a third of my portfolio companies, every single batch, are like from overseas, right? Like and a third are from the rest of the U.S. Both of the companies that come from the rest of the U.S. and the companies that come from from overseas, there's a little bit of mindset shift that they need to make when they come to Silicon Valley, because it's hyper competitive and things move very, very quickly, even compared to New York in many ways, right? Because of that density. And so half the companies are able to make that mental shift of just like there's a major sense of urgency. San Francisco is very, very expensive. Your burn rate's really, really high. And so you have to have the sense of urgency of making decisions very, very quickly, and just being action oriented. And the companies that cannot make that shift tend not to do well. And usually these are folks who come from like countries or places that are like relatively small, where like they're the big fish in small pond. I can say this as a Canadian, where Canadian companies have a huge issue of this, where like I'm awesome in Toronto and they show up in the Valley, I'm like, oh my God, like everybody here is just so much better, and they just have to step up their game. And some of them are able to do that, some of them are not.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think integral to the mindset is just confidence, which is this thing, like, people say like fake it till you make it and whatever, but that's like so core to Silicon Valley. And you see people pitching their company and like trying to raise money, and they're like, this is the most important thing I've ever worked on, and I'm gonna work on this forever. And then like 4 years later, they're building something else, and they're like, this is the most important thing I've ever worked on. I'm gonna work on this forever. And I think that's really hard to get used to, especially when you see it all the time, like people who are underrepresented in tech. Oftentimes, like those people aren't like fully indoctrinated in that like ultra confident mindset throughout their whole lives. But you kind of have to be, because something that's not necessarily obvious is a lot of the most successful people in Silicon Valley have a very high batting average. They're not just like one-hit wonders. They've tried it like 4 or 5 times, and then it works out the 5th time. But if you go home after the first time, you can never have that outcome.
I think that's really interesting, and I'm happy that we get to transition now and a little bit into the founder experience. And I want to sort of pitch a question to you, Carol. You were just talking about the experience of underrepresented founders, Craig, and it must be said you're a lady and a woman and a founder at that, a CEO of a company and a maker. And we know that there's a bit of a gender disparity in the Valley. So, what has your experience been? How would you articulate that?
Yeah, it's a very complicated subject since it's so nuanced and wrapped in many different things, and I can't do an A/B test if I was a male, for instance. I think being a founder anywhere in the world has advantages and disadvantages either way. I think there's an awareness that needs to happen to identify maybe where you might be up against certain biases and maybe use that to your advantage could be one way to do it. I came from an academic background, so I was in grad school for a long time and was sheltered from some of the politics behind the work environment and in Silicon Valley. We did pitch to like 90-some investors. Some of it was just meeting friends of our current investors and giving them a demo ride in our car because that was cool. But there's a lot of growth mindset that's needed. So to not strive for perfection, not strive for optimizing for things that don't matter. So I think there's this let's grab and go and let's just keep trying because you only need one yes. So I think to have that mindset could be one. And generally, I know that a bias against females is that they generally have more of a perfectionist attitude as opposed to a failure and dealing with failure. And there's been a lot of studies there. My experience as a female founder has been generally positive if there is a confidence aspect. One thing I did note was ageism is actually a big thing in the Valley. There is kind of two sides. One of my co-founders is a young 20-something Stanford PhD dropout, so there's that side of things. And then on the other side, I have a COO who is 60-something, and it's interesting to see other people, and I'm kind of like in the middle. I'm like in my 30s and a female, so we're a pretty diverse group. And there is biases for both sides, and I see when I'm in a meeting with my young co-founder, people look to me and the older gentleman for expertise and to lead business deals. On the other side, when they're talking about technology, they swing towards the younger side. So there are these biases, and gender is one, and I would say age is almost a larger one.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, and it ties into the next question I'm going to ask, and I'm interested in hearing from all of the panelists on this because you all bring such different perspectives. But I think we're seeing a little bit of a cultural reckoning in the Valley, right? A lot of public criticism about the Valley's culture and a lot of introspection on behalf of technology companies about the cultures that they're building. So how are you seeing that? What are your thoughts around this cultural reckoning? What do you hope comes out of it?
Me? Sure.
Go for it.
I think for the most part, it's really, really positive. Just like people are now being held accountable for their actions, and you see people arguing for the other side. They're arguing like, "Oh no, like everyone's scared to do anything," and I actually think that's not realistic. Like it's arguing from some like hyperbolic situation where like every woman is accusing every man of doing something, and that's just like not the reality of what's happening. It's like people who are dicks are being accused of being dicks and then like not allowed to, participate in the same way. So I think for the most part, we're seeing like a really positive trend, and hopefully it ends up creating a lot more role models and like more paths for people. So you don't have to be Elon Musk or Steve Jobs or whatever to be like quote successful in the Valley.
One of the things I completely agree, and I would also offer a slightly different viewpoint too, is just being mindful of what comes after this initial phase of reckoning. I wouldn't say that the best thing to do is to clear house for everybody, because that could be pretty detrimental, and then there's gaps in leadership. I do think people need to be accountable for their actions and think twice about doing things. I think the question I've been struggling with is, what do I want to see happen in Silicon Valley? And I don't know what that looks like, because it will take time to build up what is the right culture. And what I don't want is a sense of, because I think right now, across the board, Silicon Valley is scared. And what I don't want is my mentors, my male mentors that I go to dinner one-on-one alone with, now becoming scared to have dinner with me because they might accuse something might happen, or they don't want to overstep. So I want to make sure that we have a mindful culture, but it's not just reactive on fear.
I mean, like I said, I agree. Overall, it's very, very positive of people who've been taken down, should have been taken down probably a long time ago, and it does open up a lot of this stuff should be happening, and even like criticism against like a lot of like the big platforms like Facebook, where it is interesting, where if you think about like look at the media like 2 or 3 years ago, like they couldn't do any wrong, right? And now almost on the other side, they can do no right. I'm not sure that's sort of the extreme that you sort of see is a little bit scary, but at the same time, like this needed to happen, and I think the people in the Valley are not stupid, so with this reckoning, it's forcing them to sort of make a lot of like long-needed sort of changes. So, for example, VC funds now, like they know that there's a dearth of like like female sort of like investors, and they're all like actively like looking for like female investors and partners and GPs to bring on board. This is a very positive thing. This is an incredibly positive thing.
That's great. That's great. And yeah, I think for those of you who may not be as aware of some of the controversies that we're talking about, we've been mentioning or alluding to a lot of the sort of controversies around sexism in the workplace, and some people who were revealed to, like you said, be douchebags, and participate in that sexist behavior. So I think that's interesting. But I also think that, and you sort of alluded to this with your comment about the media, Marvin. But it seems that there are also some common misconceptions about Silicon Valley, and so I want to move to talking about what those are. And I am super curious to hear from you all what you think people get wrong about the Valley.
This is maybe due to my bias against sort of like media, where it's just always too positive and too negative, right? So there's always a nuance, and they don't necessarily capture sort of like what's really going on. And also the problem is just like they're the last ones to find out about stuff. And so my issue, just like recently, I've been reading a lot of stuff where it's like, oh, there's no more innovation happening in Silicon Valley. And I'm like, yeah, because like you're not in the early stage. You're not looking at like all the interesting things happening like AI or like biotech or in a lot of like the frontier sort of like tech stuff, right? Like which is just really in the early sort of like stages. They don't see any of this stuff. So all they see is just a stupid sort of like food delivery stuff, which is most of those companies are dead anyways. So they're looking at sort of like the past, right? They're fighting the wars from the past, and they're not looking at the future. And so there's a lot of really, really cool things that are happening. They're just not capturing it. And so I feel like they miss that.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. So I think like it's just like you said. Oftentimes the community in Silicon Valley feels very much the same way as the community outside of Silicon Valley, and the media wants to like use this, like everyone in Silicon Valley thinks Facebook is great and they're trying to take over the world and steal everyone's jobs, and like it's all white dudes and they're all just like sexist and they're terrible. This is just not like the reality. The reality is people are like tired of these critiques. They aren't comfortable with Facebook like manipulating how people think. They want innovation to be happening, and it is happening, and like technology is everywhere. And so kind of conflating these megacorps with technology is a mistake. And yeah, most of it is in the gray area. There's not a lot of black and white.
All right, so I'm gonna, Carol, did you want to comment? Okay, so she's like, I'm good. So I just wanted to ask one final question before we start to turn it over to the audience. And we've kind of talked about a lot of issues today, and some positive things as well. But what are some things that Silicon Valley could be doing better, in your opinion?
So much stuff.
Yeah, I would like Silicon Valley to be more proactive in helping people in the early stages, like high school, like getting into technology, and not like disqualifying yourself before you even start the race. If that makes sense. Because just like that early stage confidence, whether it's like getting some computer education, like nailing your personal finances so you can be in a position to start a company. Like those things are not being taught to the people who need it most. So you're kind of like, you start at different places. And so doing a better job and being more proactive there would be great.
Okay, so we have some questions from the audience. And I've never used Slido before, so forgive me if I just blow up the iPad. The first question is from Lydia. What experience may be brought from Silicon Valley to other parts of the world to drive digitalization and help new startups? What experience can we from Silicon Valley bring out to the world, right? So what are some lessons that we can teach out? What are some things that we can share to help new startups?
So I think that there's many different lessons from Silicon Valley, and one I do love is the guts to just go out and do something. I feel like people sometimes think in their heads too much, and also listen to others. I know that there's a lot of cynical people out there helping you by tearing apart ideas, but if you're inventing something that's never been created before, it's very fragile, and you have to almost build it and try it and find that product market fit and see these iterations through. So what I love about Silicon Valley is just the positivity and also the gusto within people to just go out and just try and fail and be okay with it. And I start to see more and more of the world and little pockets of areas have that mentality. I think that's fantastic.
Can I add one thing too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The other thing I actually wish I could see a lot more outside of the valley is just people who think really big. Like they think like global and really big, where it's like, I'm going to build something that's just going to like affect like 1 billion people in the world, right? And they think like, and I actually think that's really, really important. I worry, like I spend a lot of time in Europe and I spend a lot of time in Asia, and just a lot of times the founders just like think really small. And I think there's something about sort of like thinking big from the beginning is helpful, and being more ambitious.
I think that's great. And the next question we have from Martin, and I'm actually interested in this question too. Do you feel like there's a shortage of developers, marketers, or any other workforce in the Valley, right? So when we think about talent in the Valley and how it's sort of distributed, do you find that there's any shortages?
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the reasons that you see a lot of companies coming out to this region is trying to find engineers, right? Like engineering talent there's a dearth of engineering talent. The other thing that I see, design talent, like really good design talent is hard to find.
Yeah.
Growth people who really understand sales and marketing at the early stage, major dearth. Like there's just so few really good sort of like online marketing and B2B sales experts for the early stage, at least for our stage. So there's just a dearth of talent in general.
And I'm going to drill down on that a little bit because my company used to do recruiting. And Carol even talked about this backstage, is that sometimes Silicon Valley looks for a lot of boxes for you to check in order to be competitive in these companies, right? The right schools and what have you. So if somebody doesn't check those boxes but is interested in maybe filling some of those talent shortages, what advice would you give them?
What I would say is that I would say that the box check stuff is that because there's this dearth, it's a unique opportunity. The one good thing I really like about the Valley is like ultimately we don't really care where you come from and what you do, as long as you can actually show results and you just get stuff done. And so I think it's such a great time now where you have like all these tools of like Udemy and Coursera and all these things where you can actually learn this stuff like online and just practice it right away. And so if you can show results, let's say in online marketing, you can go and say, hey, like I'll run a bunch of campaigns for you. If I can share, if I can actually deliver these customers' results for you, then like give me a gig and I'll take over for you. Like most companies most companies are very open-minded about that. And so they don't care where you come from.
Yeah, I do see a lot of Silicon Valley companies looking for the same Silicon Valley people, and you obviously are a small startup with limited capital, and you want someone with a proven track record or someone that looks the same as you. And I think that kind of breeds this issue of, we had it in our company too, where we had a tough coding challenge, which was, Google focused, and the way that we screened was very, it was definitely on the meritocracy side. And it took us some time, and it's a huge problem for companies is how you hire. And there's no good solution, and that's why I really love what Project Include is doing, is to really try to break out of the preconceived notions of what you know, to open up other pockets of talent that you might not realize. I'm not a Stanford homegrown person, and I think one of the challenges was coming to a startup with very different ideas or a different type of training, and just getting the buy-in for ideas was surprisingly more challenging than if I was to take a randomly diverse crowd, which when I talked to other people, the ideas made sense, but when I brought it back to a Stanford-bred crowd, it didn't get the reception because they hadn't been trained that way or hadn't seen it before. And if they hadn't seen it as a group, then obviously it was not a good idea. So I think things like that actually hurt Silicon Valley. And being able to just find different people. And also, I think one of the other things is not just focusing on the technology. So I think there's really strong business people, marketing people, and those all, we're not building just technology. You're trying to build a business. So realizing the other sides of the business and putting an importance on that is critical.
Yeah, I would just add to that, like the highest leverage thing you can have is someone who's really technical that also understands product. Like if you have those two things, the rest kind of figures itself out. I would agree that like credentialism is terrible in hurting Silicon Valley, and those people that are like moving to Facebook and because it's cool, like Facebook's basically like the Goldman Sachs of like 15 years ago, and like that's not helping. Like the Stanford MBAs, all that stuff. And so again, I would like encourage people to, like, do not disqualify yourself before you even get started. Just like try the stuff out and just like ship things, and you stand out very easily.
Thank you for that advice. And we're going to switch gears for a second, and I feel like we're doing a lot of like poo-pooing the Valley, and I don't want to, but I do want to ask this question, so I'm going to ask it anyways. Do you think that the Valley might have become too competitive and too expensive as an initial destination from startups overseas? And I just, want to share a little bit. We know that like the Valley is expensive, like we said. Different people have different resources. We know that companies quite often are started with either support from families or personal finances. And in the Bay Area, one of the most expensive cities in the world, that can be very difficult. So do you think it's now too competitive? Do you think that it's too expensive as an initial destination? And if so, are there other places that you have your eye on?
I can take this one. I think the answer to this one is the famous VC answer is it depends, right? So a lot of it really depends on what you're doing. So for example, if you're like in SaaS or like certain industries, like the Valley is still the best place, even though with the high costs, because you want access to those people, your potential customers, potential partners. You're in AI, it probably makes a lot of sense. Or maybe Toronto might make sense in that case too. But I just think like a lot of it should really be determined. For example, if you're a fashion tech company, like I think the Valley's like the worst place. Like look at how badly dressed we are, right? Like with the exception, you're very finely dressed. But with the exception, like Valley people are just like, this is not a fashion capital world. So New York or London was probably better. Like basically go to where the nexus or the center of like that network of that industry is, right? So fintech, there are a lot of great fintech companies in the Valley, but New York or London is probably better, right? So I think a lot of it really depends on what you are working on and what your business is and where that network is.
I thought it was also impressive because you were saying that 500 startups had invested in a lot of Estonian and Latvian companies as well. So you're obviously looking elsewhere.
Yeah, we hunt for companies like in every country. So we've invested in startups. About a third of our 1,800 company portfolio is actually outside the U.S. Because we like the talent. They're just as good in many cases. In most cases, they're just as good as the talent we're finding in the U.S.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, like we get these kind of questions like about YC applications all the time. It's like, do I need to move to Silicon Valley? Do I need a co-founder? Do I need to do this? Do I need to do that? And again, like, just get started. Like it's not about your outfit or like how many co-founders you have or where you live. There are certainly advantages, but like the main thing is to get started, and then the rest will figure itself out.
Okay. And so we have another question sort of about the culture of the Valley, and that is, has the recent situation in Hollywood impacted tech too, in a sense that people are getting taken more seriously and not ignored or dismissed? And so I think this goes back to some of our discussions around sexual harassment and the fact that in Hollywood, especially, we're having a huge reckoning with people who are being revealed to be sexual harassers and who are being held accountable. So do you think that's impacting tech, or how do you see that? How do you see that relationship? Everybody's looking at Carol.
I feel weird. It's like,
the
as
men
like
can answer too.
Right, it's like, as the white guy on the panel. Yeah, I mean, definitely. But it's happening in Silicon Valley too. I think it's just way bigger and more covered in Hollywood.
Yeah, I always think this is funny because I get a little protective about tech, and I was like, tech did it first, but I think Hollywood obviously did it a little bit more visibly. And so I do have one more question. So I want to end on a positive note, and it says that there are some issues about starting in the Valley. What are some reasons to start your company in the Valley? So what do you think is one of the best things the Valley has to offer before we go?
I mean, the access to the people and the best practices and the learnings is such a, like I said, the densest part of the network for tech. And so the amount of people that you just randomly meet in coffee shops, the serendipity that happens because of this density is incredibly powerful for startups.
Yeah, I would say definitely the networking effect out there, the amount of capital. It's, there's like one street where all the VCs are living, so it's just easy to kind of go down and pitch in over a week.
All their offices are on the same street. They don't live on the same street.
Literally on the same street.
They might live.
And it is a very, very positive place where ideas are accepted and people help you think through it by trying to add value to your idea. So I thought that was it's a fantastic place for that.
Yeah. Same thing. People, money. Also, the weather's really nice. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the thing.
The weather's great. All right, thank you all so much for joining us this late morning, and thank you for sticking with us too. All right, awesome. Good job. Thank you.